Thank you for stopping by. Since the publication of the polemical essay Preparations for the Gospel by Church Father Eusebius of Caesarea in the 4th century, Greek letter names are believed to have no meaning in Greek. Instead, it is thought they were borrowed from a Semitic language, such as Phoenician, where they do have significance. The Greeks likely adapted and used the Phoenician letters to represent the sounds of their own language. How plausible is this theory? This presentation explores the letter alpha and its name. Where does the symbol alpha originate? What does the name alpha mean in Semitic languages, and does it hold a meaning in Greek? Was it invented or adapted to transcribe a sound, a phoneme, or for some other reason? The Greek name alpha has been spelt and pronounced in the same way since Plato and is generally regarded as a loanword from the Semitic ʔalf or ʔalp, known as ʔalef in English. The phonetic representation of the Semitic term and its Latin transliteration vary considerably in the literature because the Semitic abjads lack vowels. Furthermore, its pronunciation differs across languages and dialects within the Semitic family, influenced by semantic context and historical period. John Peters, for example, reports a Hebrew or Syriac ʔalef, a Samaritan ʔalf, and an Arabic or Ethiopic ʔalf. Ignace Gelb refers to it as ʔalef. The reconstructed Proto-Semitic root ʔalp means thousand. However, it probably did not originally refer specifically to the numeral 1000, as alpha does in Greek, but rather to an amount of similar magnitude, a large number. In Ethiopic, it often signifies a myriad. The root also means cattle head, to tame, domesticate, familiarize, instruct, unite, or join. To familiarize or instruct may include learn, teach, as suggested by Eusebius, while to unite or join may include to add, as follows. The initial phonetic form of the root ʔalp has yet to be determined. From two different manuscripts, we know that the 3rd century BC translation of the Bible, from Biblical Hebrew to Greek, known as the Septuagint, translated the Semitic letter name as ʔalf or ʔalef. Modern Hebrew utilizes diacritics to modify vowels, affecting the pronunciation and meaning of words. The difference in pronunciation between the biblical ʔalef and modern Hebrew ʔalef is barely noticeable. Both terms refer to the first letter of the alphabet, ʔalef, similar to the Greek letter alpha. The modern form is the pausal ʔalef, which means thousand, millennium, hilo. The plural is ʔalafim, meaning cattle or oxen. A defective spelling of the verb ʔalef signifies to tame, train, teach, learn. Could the Semitic ʔalef convey a shared semantic concept across these terms? The evidence presented in a moment suggests that it instead relates to a semantic cluster involving the notions of a number, value, price, or exchange, aligning thus with the Greek letter alpha. In his article titled The Egyptian Origin of the Semitic Alphabet, published in the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology in 1916, the renowned Egyptologist Alan Gardner proposed that the Phoenician sign ʔalef originated from an Egyptian hieroglyph depicting an ox head, and its name, ʔalef, meant ox head. In other words, the Phoenician sign was initially an abstracted pictogram, and its name iconically described what the sign referred to, that is, its referent. Note that this iconicity is gradually lost as the ox head pictogram is first simplified in Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions, then abstracted to 3 linear strokes and tilted in Phoenician inscriptions, turned upside down in Greek, or replaced with other, more or less complex symbols in other alphabets. Today, Gardner's proposition enjoys widespread acceptance among scholars, textbook authors, and social media enthusiasts. During this pictographic evolution, the sign seems to have also altered its phonetic value. For the original Egyptian pictogram of an ox head, Gardner reports the phonetic value of ka, similar to the initial sounds of the English cow or calf. The voiceless velar plosive may have shifted to a voiceless glottal fricative, as in half, in Proto-Sinaitic, before becoming a glottal stop in the Phoenician alphabet, eventually undergoing elision to serve as a phonetic placeholder for vowels, known as mater lectionis in modern Hebrew. This gradual lenition from stop to fricative mirrors, typologically, the consonantal weakening described in Grimm's law, which concerns systematic phonetic changes in Germanic consonants. The phonetic form of modern Hebrew was largely shaped during its revival in the late 19th century by Ashkenazi, Yiddish-speaking Europeans. While the revivalists based their vocabulary on Biblical and Mishnaic Hebrew and adopted the Sephardi vowel system as normative, their pronunciation, stress, and consonant patterns reflected the phonetic habits of Yiddish and Central European languages. The resulting Israeli Hebrew is therefore a hybrid, a Semitic lexicon articulated within a predominantly European phonetic framework. The point is, the so-called glottal stop in ʔalf may never have existed in the ancient language. The evidence from the Septuagint manuscripts, which are the earliest Greek transcriptions of Hebrew, suggests that the letter was pronounced simply as a vowel, a, not as a consonant. Names beginning with ʔalef were rendered in Greek with an initial alpha, as in Abraham, Adam, Aaron, etc., not with any sign of a glottal sound. It is therefore likely that ʔalef originally represented a pure vowel, and that the notion of a glottal consonant was a later grammatical abstraction. There are challenges at every level, graphic, phonetic, and semantic, in the main argument that ʔalef originated from the Egyptian ox head sign. First, there is no archaeological evidence to connect the so-called Proto-Sinaitic and later Phoenician shapes of the symbol. Second, in the oldest known Phoenician inscription, that of the Ahiram sarcophagus, the ʔalef characters are drawn with the vertical stroke passing directly through the vertex of the two diagonal lines. This arrangement makes the sign resemble kaf rather than ʔalef. Third, the theory provides no plausible explanation for why a pictogram of an ox head would come to represent either a glottal stop or an open vowel. The link between image and phonetic value remains arbitrary. And fourth, no explanation has been given for any semantic shift linking an ox head with the later meanings of ʔalef. Ideas of numerical value, such as thousand or myriad, or of intellectual activity, such as teaching or learning. Some supporters of the Egyptian origin theory try to resolve this discrepancy by arguing that the Semitic creators of the alphabet were not trained scribes, but ordinary speakers lacking formal literacy. According to this view, they borrowed Egyptian hieroglyphs based solely on visual similarity. They chose the pictogram of an ox head and assigned it the phonetic value of a glottal stop, simply because their own word for ox or cow began with that sound. The original meaning of the pictogram was no longer relevant. It was merely a mnemonic device for pronunciation. In this interpretation, the alphabet represents a significant abstraction. Letters do not carry meaning, but only denote phonetic values. Now, let us regard alpha not merely as a sound or a faint outline of an ox-head pictogram, but as a concept, a graphemic symbol, an ideogram, encoding value, quantity, and calculation. We will explore evidence across languages and scripts: Greek, Semitic, Cretan, Egyptian, and English, a Germanic language, to revisit the origins and significance of this fundamental sign. Symbols resembling the Phoenician ʔalef and Greek alpha have been discovered among petroglyphs in the mountains of Armenia, dating back to the 7th millennium BC. In the Balkans, at sites of the Vinča culture dating from the 6th to the 4th millennium BC. in Philocopy on Milos from the final third of the 3rd millennium BC, and in Troy 4 and 5 around the start of the 2nd millennium BC. Numerous specimens and variants have also been found in Crete during the first 3/4 of the 2nd millennium BC and in Cyprus in the latter half of the same period. There is no strong reason to believe a Levantine origin for the epicoric and classical Greek forms of alpha. Similar or closely related signs were already in use across the Aegean islands, the Balkans, and nearby regions for at least 1,000 years before the emergence of the so-called Phoenician alphabet at Byblos. The earliest ancestors of the symbol may date back to Armenia, while Armenian petroglyphs and the so-called Old European signs are not officially classified as writing systems by mainstream linguists, and the early Minoan scripts remain undeciphered. It is much more likely that Aegean scribes relied on a familiar regional set of symbols when developing their alphabet rather than importing a Levantine character of uncertain phonetic and semantic significance. Indeed, the Armenian, Old European, and most Old Aegean signs are found in isolation. We cannot be certain what language, if any, they might have represented, and the chance of deciphering them remains very slim. However, if a sign is intuitively iconic, it can communicate meaning visually. Modern traffic and safety symbols, for instance, have no phonetic values. They do not form a script in the strict linguistic sense, yet they deliver clear messages with little or no explanation. They create a silent, visual language. Now, consider the ancient Greek lexical material presented here, a small but coherent family of words derived from the root ʔalf. The minimal verb alphano consists of the root ʔalf and the generic verbal suffix ano. More than 300 Greek verbs end with ano. This ending also exists as an independent adverb meaning up, upper, above, high, and as a verb meaning to accomplish, finish, or come to an end. In this context, alphano seems to imply a form of completion or achievement from ano applied to a measurable or valuable entity, ʔalf, such as food, income, or labor. According to Hesychius, alphano is synonymous with alpha-d and eurisco. The latter, well known internationally through its aorist exclamation eureka, means to find, discover, devise, acquire, gain, or determine. That is, to ascertain or establish precisely, usually as a result of research or calculation. Another instructive form is ʔalfi, very likely the Ionic equivalent of a Doric alpha, since the interchange of Doric alpha with Ionic eta is a well-documented dialectal variation. If so, alpha would signify a produce, product, gain. Consequently, it is incorrect to claim that alpha, the name of the letter, has no meaning in Greek. Conversely, the lexical evidence indicates that alpha belongs to a profoundly coherent semantic field of value, acquisition, achievement, and reckoning. Hesychius also glosses alphi with timi, honor, esteem, estimation, authority, worth, value, price, valuation, estimate for purposes of assessment, compensation, or penalty, and with oni, buying, purchasing, purchase, bargain, deed of sale, contract, purchase money, price. Hesychius himself even compares alphi, price, with alpha, the name of the letter. The association is clear. Alpha, far from being a meaningless sound, encodes the idea of worth, gain, price, a value to be calculated or estimated. Because, as shown in a separate analysis, the sign eta expresses a length value while alpha generally indicates a value, the well-known Doric alpha, versus Ionic eta, alternation, can be reconsidered. Instead of being purely phonetic or dialectal, it reflects a conceptual distinction. Alpha iconically refers to a heap as a symbol of value, while ʔalf more precisely refers to the height of a heap, representing a measurable numeric value. The presence of eta in ʔalf thus echoes the same length value that h carries in the English half. What traditional philology calls dialectal variation may, in fact, preserve graphically encoded conceptual categories. Viewed graphically, the Greek word ʔalf resolves into a clear sequence of strokes. Each element holds its own visual and conceptual significance. Alpha signifies value, the mass or quantity to be considered. Lambda depicts the rising outline of the heap, the measure taken from that heap. Phi is the division, the stroke that separates and assesses, and eta signifies the distance or height at which the heap is divided. Together, these letters perform the operation that the word itself names. ʔalf equals heap plus division plus level. This internal structure explains why alpha and half are not coincidentally similar. However, there is a difference. The metathesis of the h, or eta, moving from a word final position in ʔalf to a word initial position in half, alters the syntax of the underlying semantics and emphasizes what is measured. While ʔalf highlights the value of the heap, half stresses the height of the division. Both express the same measurement of a quantifiable quantity, but adapt to language-specific rules and conventions, as well as to what the author-coiner intended to emphasize. Even the English word heap maintains this logic. It contains h, a, and p as a half phi, the same strokes of length, mass, and division. The vowel sequence ea in heap represents a long e, precisely the sound value of the Greek eta in ʔalf. The phonetic similarity reinforces the graphic one. In this context, the Semitic form ʔalef and even the English ʔael appear not as random phonetic coincidences, but as anagrams and cognates of alpha. All share the same semantic core: to heap, to value, to reckon, to divide. These convergences suggest a single conceptual field underpinning the earliest alphabetic names, a field of measurable value encoded both in stroke composition and in phonetic sequence. The ancient Greek alphadion is derived as the diminutive of alpha. A diminutive, in linguistic terms, is a type of hyponym, a child category within a parent class. As a hyponym of alpha, alphadion pertains to a specific, practical application of the valuation concept. In ancient sources, it appears as a tool used to check horizontality, verticality, or inclination, a device for measuring angles. Shaped like the letter A, it literally embodied its name. This instrument is the ancestor of today's spirit level. Although its form has evolved, its name persists, highlighting the remarkable way language preserves history. With it, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the pyramids of Egypt, and the temples of Greece were constructed. In modern Greek, alphadi still refers to a class of tools used by masons, carpenters, cabinet makers, and surveyors, different in form, yet united by the same purpose: to measure and verify balance. Another alpha-shaped measurement tool is the compass. Figurative compass signs have been found among the Cretan hieroglyphs. Compasses are used to draw circles and to measure short, precise distances, but alpha can also be seen as a divided heap. A complete heap is represented by the two oblique strokes of the sign, while the medial stroke divides that heap into parts, indicating the level of an accumulated or consumed half. Unlike the ox-head sign, which loses its iconicity when turned upside down, a value ideogram such as alpha remains meaningful in any orientation. If alpha were rotated horizontally, it would resemble an implement for measuring vertical distance. Turned upside down, it would evoke a half-filled container. The Semitic ʔalf, meaning a large number or addition, that is, an act of joining or uniting, and the Old English half, meaning a part or division, may both have originated as phonetic corruptions of the root ʔalf, a term for an amount, a quantity, or a value to be measured or reckoned. The reconstructed Proto-Germanic root halbe, meaning something divided, and its Old Saxon form halbe would in turn correspond not to half, but to the letter name alpha itself. May we insert a parenthesis here? The English verb to halve primarily means to reduce something to half its original amount or to divide it into two parts. A synchronic variation is observed between the voiced labiodental fricative V in the verb and the voiceless F in the noun, both ultimately derived from a root containing the voiced bilabial stop B. This bifurcating phonetic evolution challenges the idea of systematic, yet semantically neutral and linearly predictable sound change often assumed in linguistic theory. Voicing results from the energetic vibration of the vocal cords during speech. It is therefore neither arbitrary nor solely physiological, but semantically motivated. We activate vocal vibration when describing an energetic, dynamic act, such as dividing or cutting into pieces, whereas no vibration is needed to denote the static state of the inert parts. The word halve sounds like to halve and alpha. It simply means sweet confection in Arabic. The first recorded recipe appears in the early 13th century Arabic cookbook Kitab al-Tabikh, the Book of Dishes. Its origins, however, remain debated, reminding us that the earliest mention does not necessarily mean invention. Some food historians suggest an Arab or Persian origin, while others propose a Byzantine one. Initially, it was a paste made of dates, milk, or flour, bound with honey or syrup. Over the centuries, it has evolved into countless regional forms: semolina with ghee in India, tahini with nuts in the Levant, sunflower seed blocks in Eastern Europe. Trade routes, empires, and migrations carried it from the Middle East across the Mediterranean, the Balkans, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. Today, halve remains a symbol of tradition, hospitality, celebration, and even ritual mourning across cultures. Perhaps the only common feature of this type of confection is that it is typically prepared for ceremonies, divided into calculated pieces, and often associated with halving, whether for distribution or dieting. If we regard the angular form of alpha as a schematic compass, a truss, or a divided heap, the letter becomes an iconic representation, an ideogram of measurement and quantity. Its origin and use are rooted not in orality, but in material culture, production, architecture, design, engineering, commerce, and accounting. Here, iconicity links form to practice. To measure is to divide, to mark a portion, to assign value. At least in the case of alpha, the evidence indicates that the sign was not created to denote a sound, but to symbolize a concept, a quantifiable value. Another argument from Greek morphology is the productive role of inversion. Briefly, inverting a letter cluster produces words with opposite or complementary meanings, sometimes outright antonyms. At the very least, inversion results in roots from the same semantic field. This principle is documented throughout this series of presentations. The inversion of alpha forms ʔalf. ʔalf creates two words in ancient Greek: ʔalfai, meaning destruction, extinction, or loss. It is an antonym of gain, as signified by alphi. The form ʔalfai, glossed as ʔapalisai, means to destroy utterly, to lose, to perish. A lost word opposing alpha's gain semantics, particularly that of the minimal noun alphi, meaning gain. This pattern shows that the root's semantic field is not only positive valuation, but also reversible through morphological inversion, gain versus loss, add versus remove. Aphlaston, the poop of a ship, refers to a raised, convex surface that cannot contain water and carries some destructive connotations. In nautical terminology, pooping of a ship refers to damage or even destruction caused by a wave breaking over the stern when riding before a following sea. The term aphlaston, however, presents a more complex case. The poop deck, located at the stern, often follows an alpha-shaped floor plan, which may explain the apparent inversion of alpha within aphlaston. Interestingly, aphlaston may be analyzed as the inversion of nost alpha. The cluster St functions as an inseparable digraph in ancient Greek and cannot be reversed, leaving nost, from nostos, return, as the main semantic element. Therefore, nost alpha would mean the alpha of return, possibly referring to the alpha-shaped stern of the ship, the point of return or reverse movement. The echo between stern and return is more than phonetic. It reflects the same conceptual axis of orientation and reversal. In this reading, aphlaston captures the turned alpha shape of the stern. In words starting with AFL, the initial alpha often functions as a privative prefix, indicating negation or reversal. The consonant cluster FL, however, tends to form words related to intense or excessive growth, or, conversely, with diminishment. For example, in forms such as fleo, to overflow, teem with abundance, and fleo, to swell, burst out, the cluster FL conveys an image of expansion or release. In flao, to crush, eat up, the same phonetic nucleus instead signifies contraction or reduction. Perhaps the most iconic instance is phlox, flame, fire, whose semantic field combines both tendencies. Fire expands through the very act of consuming. The FL onset, therefore, encodes a polarity of growth and reduction, a dynamic consonantal symbolism observable across related roots. These two opposing forces are visually embodied in the shape of alpha. Its oblique strokes define a range between minimum and maximum height and width, while its medial bar indicates an intermediate level. The measure of a heap, a contained quantity, or a variable value. The preceding phi appears to signal the division of the following lambda into two diverging strokes, one ascending, the other descending. Alternatively, the sequence phi lambda can be interpreted as partition the heap, while its inversion, lambda phi, communicates the opposite operation, heap up the parts. This perspective redefines the relationship between the Semitic references of ʔalf, thousand, ox, cattle, teach, learn, join, and those of the Greek alpha, value, price, measuring, reckoning, estimation. While Semitic scholarship often stresses an original sense of ox, the Greek evidence indicates a broader semantic hierarchy in which cattle, ox head, thousand, education, construction, or manufacture serve as hyponyms of value, specific areas requiring reckoning and valuation. Therefore, terms for ox or cattle are better understood not as the etymological origins of alpha or ʔalf, but as tangible instances of items to be counted and evaluated. An ox head, in this context, represents a head count. Across centuries and languages, words for livestock and goods came to signify capital. Medieval Latin capitale shifted from meaning property, stock, to our modern sense of capital, economic value separated from specific goods. Likewise, for the Greeks, words linked to alpha denoted both tangible produce and the more abstract concept of value or price. This evolution shows how practical counting methods give rise to conceptual categories of wealth and calculation. Current phonocentric theory derives ox from the hypothetical Proto-Indo-European root uxen, meaning male animal, literally sprinkler, through the Proto-Germanic stem uxen. More precisely, phonocentrically inclined historical linguists reconstruct such roots from attested cognate spellings based on consistent phonetic correspondences. However, these remain educated extrapolations, since proto-languages are, by definition, unattested and therefore not empirically verifiable. In archaic Greek inscriptions, depending on the dialect, the letters chi and xi were often represented by the same symbol, similar to the Latin x. In some early instances, chi appears as the digraph kh, while xi may be depicted as xs, ks with the letter san, or even hs. The cursive form of the lowercase xi resembles an extended final sigma, which was frequently interpreted in Latin as a double s. If we assume that the early spellings of ox reflect local linguistic adaptations of a Greek root transmitted through various phonetic or orthographic systems, it becomes plausible that the Proto-Indo-European reconstruction ultimately traces back to that Greek source. It is noteworthy that Greek is conspicuously absent from the published PIE reconstructions. This raises the question: is there a Greek word that could plausibly serve as the cognate or root of the Indo-European and other ox-like terms meaning bull? The minimal verb oheo first appears in Homer's Odyssey, meaning to suffer, endure, carry, drive, ride, or employ in a chariot. Its cognate minimal noun, ohos, is also Homeric, denoting a carriage, chariot, or wagon. The phrase trokloi ohoi refers to the swift or circular bearers of the chariot, that is, the wheels. Another minimal noun formed with omicron key, ohi, means prop, support, or food. The animal historically used for its endurance in such heavyweight tasks as ploughing or carriage drawing is the bull, the male ox. A later derivative, oheion, attested in Strabo and Plutarch and traceable to the 1st century BC, designates a male animal kept for breeding. If the Greek grapheme chi, which in archaic form resembled the Latin x, was once read as such, then its pronunciation as oxeion would approximate the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European root oxen. The bull, or ox, was thus named not for its besprinkling or generative behavior as a male animal suggested by the phonocentric reconstruction, but for its endurance, its capacity to bear, suffer, and support the plough and the carriage. Another graphically, grammatically, and semantically related minimal verb, eho, means both to bear, carry, bring, and to have, hold, possess, acquire, or be wealthy. Yet in Homer, it also conveys to support, guide, steer, or drive. In early antiquity, almost everything humans had, in the literal and economic sense, depended on the ox. The term cow originally referred to female bovines, particularly domesticated ones. The variation of u and o in Germanic cognates, kuo, cow, ku, reflects the Greek-Latin interchange between o and u. Etymologists trace cow to Proto-Germanic quan, and ultimately to Proto-Indo-European gu, meaning ox, bull, cow. The Old High German kuo phonetically aligns with the Greek verb kuo, a post-Homeric form of kueo, meaning to conceive, to be pregnant, used both literally for women and animals in Herodotus and Plato, and metaphorically for cities or souls that bear or bring forth. The similarity between kuo and kuo, along with the later English correction ending with a w, reminiscent of the Greek omega, may suggest not mere coincidence, but parallel formations rooted in the same semantic realm of fecundity, conception, and bearing. While the standard phonocentric model reconstructs a Proto-Indo-European root gu based on comparative evidence, such reconstructions remain hypothetical, as proto-languages are, by definition, unattested. The closer phonetic and semantic match between kuo and kuo hints that the Greek root could have influenced early Germanic words through written transmission or cultural contact rather than shared ancestry. Once again, Greek is absent from the published attempts at reconstruction. Cattle originally referred to property of any kind, including money, land, or income, rather than specifically oxen or cows. It is traditionally traced to the Proto-Indo-European root kaput, meaning head, a derivation that again overlooks possible Greek cognates or origins. However, the Old French forms suggest a potential Greek origin. The term catel could plausibly be a fusion of kata, distributively, of a whole divided into parts, in relation to, individually, partially, in accordance with, and telos, meaning coming to pass, performance, event, outcome, result, product, service rendered by a citizen, and their rating according to this service, obligation to render a service or payment, financial means, expenditure, degree of completion or attainment, state or degree of maturity, age, term, course, or achievement. The noun telos also bears connotations of authority and decisive power. If catel indeed originated as a Greek kata-telos fusion, then its later English form, cattle, would not denote an absolute measure of wealth, but rather a relative or distributive quantity, a product or yield per head, per unit of time, or per unit of space. This sense clarifies its connection with Latin capitalis. In this interpretation, cattle refers not primarily to large domestic mammals, although their number could conveniently indicate household wealth, but to a conceptual variable similar to modern capital or earnings per capita, something to be calculated or reckoned. Such a notion aligns closely with the symbolic field of the Greek alpha, which signifies valuation, measurement, or reckoning. The Semitic ʔalef may have once expressed a comparable concept, although its original semantics seem to have faded. Finally, if we take hatio as the root of the first element in Old French châtel, meaning tangible, movable property, the sense of the compound is further nuanced, indicating property in relation to need, or relative possession. Minimal semantic pairing is a potent method for deducing the sememes linked to a morpheme, whether it is a letter cluster or a single letter. In its broadest form, this technique involves adding, removing, inverting, exchanging, or displacing the morpheme in relation to a core lexical string, then observing whether a new word is formed and how its meaning differs from the original. The method is conceptually inspired by mutation studies in genetics. By altering a single component, we can isolate its semantic effect. When the letter alpha is added at the start of a word, it has been observed to enhance, intensify, or negate the meaning of the base. In such cases, it functions as a copulative, intensive, or privative prefix, respectively. Whether these represent 2 or 3 distinct types of alpha prefix is debated. Nonetheless, in all cases, the prefix acts as a quantitative semantic modulator, aligning with the iconic heap-like shape of the letter itself. For example, while throos means noise from many voices, murmur of crowds or assembly, where not everyone speaks simultaneously, a throos signifies all together, in crowds, heaps, or masses, and, depending on the tonic accent, may also mean noiseless. Similarly, a threesma means sum, gathering, aggregation, collection. As an independent word, the letter alpha functions as an exclamation, expressing pain, grief, pity, envy, contempt, or surprise, analogous to the Latin or alas, but it can also signify laughter. The contrast between these emotional uses is indicated by the breathing diacritic. A cry-like sound is produced with exhalation, while laughter generally requires inhalation. Because ancient spelling was not always phonetically consistent and lexicographic lemmas may overlap, some ambiguity is expected. For example, surprise is usually accompanied by a sudden, short, inward breath and would be iconically best rendered with the spiritus asper, the rough breathing, sign resembling an upstream arrow, and with a short, descending, upstream ascending, tonic accent, dharia, heavy. In contrast, laughter involves a long, repeated phonation sustained by inward breath, best described by an upstream breathing mark, spiritus asper, combined with a circumflex accent, resembling a wavy macron. Negative emotions, such as pain or grief, are expressed through a long, strong, but rather steady exhalation and are appropriately marked by a downstream breath mark, spiritus lenis, and a circumflex accent. In Latin, a similar contrast is shown by grapho-semantic inversion through the metathesis of the length sign h, which is initial in forms linked to laughter, and final in those indicating lament. More subtle nuances of phonation, associated with pity, envy, contempt, or with pleasant versus unpleasant surprise, could further be specified with the acute accent, downstream ascending, the left stroke of the alpha sign, and other diacritic combinations. However, in continuous written text, the meaning and vocal quality of a vowel become clear from the surrounding letters and words, making such diacritics largely unnecessary. The exclamation "ah" or "ah" exists right at the boundary between pre-linguistic sound and proto-symbolic utterance. In infant vocal behavior, it serves a fundamental role, both physiologically and semiotically. It is produced even by newborns, effortlessly and without training. It is a physiological reflex linked to breath and emotion. Because "ah" is one of the easiest and most natural human vocalizations to produce, it requires no training, and we find interjections like "ah," "ha" in virtually every language family, albeit with different emotional and contextual values. Infants start to cry "ah" immediately after birth. By about 6 to 9 months, "ah" often becomes an attention-grabbing signal, a way to call the caregiver or respond to novelty, essentially the first exclamation mark of human communication. Infant vocalizations are characterized by intonation and duration, not lexical meaning. So, "ah" is not yet a word, but it conveys breath and emotion through sound, forming the beginning of meaning. The open vowel "ah" is the first phoneme in life that is physiologically linked to want, abundance, and surprise. If someone were to create a phoneme for a grapheme designed to represent discoveries that satisfy a need, the open vowel would be the natural choice. The opposite process is less intuitive. One would have to design a symbol and invent a complex name using additional letters for a primordial phoneme that even babies can cry. Bringing the evidence together, a coherent hypothesis arises. The letter A, in its various early forms across Crete, the Balkans, Egypt, and the Levant, is best understood as an iconic sign of a measured amount, whether a compass, a plough, or a half heap. The Greek lexicon maintains a productive ʔalf cluster whose meanings of yield, measurement, and price correspond with this iconography. Semitic reflexes such as ʔalf or ʔalf that mean thousand or large number also align with this valuation logic. Cattle and oxen appear as hyponyms, concrete valuables counted by a society, but not necessarily as the primary etymon. Methodologically, this case warns us against oversimplified acrophony and the assumption of linear borrowing without testing internal productivity. Letter names and shapes should be viewed as part of a semantic graphemic ecology. The sign's shape, the semantics of its name in each language, and the distribution of cognates together create the evidentiary corpus. When we adopt such an integrated approach, the valuation hypothesis for alpha becomes more explanatory. In summary, alpha and its cognates are best understood through a semantic core of value, quantity, and measurement. The compass, plow, container, or half heap visually encode a measured quantity. The Greek ʔalf lexicon encapsulates commercial and metrological practices. Semitic ʔalef forms signify property, large numerals, and intellectual values. Cattle appear as units of value, hypernyms, not as the conceptual source. Alpha, then, is a letter of reckoning, a sign that names what can be counted, weighed, and priced. Let us examine more closely the stroke composition that underpins the idea of half. Considering the letter H as a symbol formed of 3 strokes, a bar flanked by 2 uprights, it already conveys a sense of distance or length. The next symbol, A, shaped like a lambda bisected by a medial stroke, indicates a heap of variable height resting on a baseline. L, simplified here to a vertical and a horizontal stroke at level 0, functions as that baseline itself, often silent or unpronounced, serving as the line upon which quantities rest. The final sign, phi or F, originally a circle divided by a vertical diameter line, is a divider, a mark of bisection. When combined, these strokes form a coherent graphic sequence. H for distance or length, A for heap or substance, L for baseline, phi for division, or F for a scale from 0 to a maximum with a medial value mark. The L remained there mainly for historical reasons. As its shape evolved in Latin, it no longer symbolizes the heap and adds little to the concept. This is probably why it is not pronounced. The English word half thus visualizes the very operation it refers to, the point at which a heap is divided, a portion or measurable amount. To conclude, consider this figure again. The top row displays compass-like Cretan signs. The bottom row illustrates the semantic sketch of alpha as an alpha-shaped, half-consumed pile. When alphabets were formed, they did so not only by abstracting sounds into pictures, or rather vice versa, but also by transferring conceptual practices, methods of measurement, sharing, and valuation, into the smallest marks on the page. Alpha is therefore less an ox head and more a ledger mark, a grapheme of account, a graphic for worth. Thank you.